As children, play patterns are an interesting thing, especially when it comes to our toys, specifically our beloved lines from the 80s. Take G.I. Joe for an example. I mean, the lore dictates that the Joes will always win against Cobra and send them running off in defeat every single time. But who's to stop us from letting our bad guys get a win every now and then? And not just a win, but totally mop the floor with those real American heroes, which is pretty much the play pattern I used whenever I broke out my action figures and started playing Death Joe, the rules of which were pretty simple. Everybody dies. Back in the 80s, the original G.I. Joe cartoons were probably best known for showing the extreme lengths Cobra would go to defeat G.I. Joe, from building massive contraptions like mass devices and weather dominators, and less conventional stuff like fatal fluffies and the devil's music, to more subtle but equally dirty schemes like kidnapping Joe family members and brainwashing them to do their bidding. But regardless of whatever Cobra did, they never managed to defeat G.I. Joe, and even worse, they failed to send a single one of those real American heroes to their graves. Well, to be fair, there were no Cobras that kicked the proverbial bucket either. One thing was clear when it came to the cartoons: death did not exist. No matter how often the Joes and Cobras ran at each other with laser guns ablazing, not a single person was ever hit. And here we are giving stormtroopers so much flack. Whether it would be a jet or a tank blown to bits or shot down in a blaze of glory, you will always see a Lucky Joe or Cobra jump off or parachute to safety right before any explosion. Simply put, as far as the kids' cartoons were concerned in the 80s, death of any kind was off limits. Nobody ever died. Of course, we all know that when it came to G.I. Joe, Hasbro employed the multiple-prong approach to sell their toys, and the cartoons, which took care of attracting a younger audience, was only half the battle. The other half was the comics, originally published by Marvel and pretty much completely written by Larry Hama, who had the near impossible task of pushing the Joes to a slightly older audience with more grounded and realistic stories, but at the same time, still sell as much toys as he could by constantly featuring as many of them as possible in his stories. And when it comes to a military war-themed book, well, the reality is that people die. No matter how highly trained these operatives are, no one is safe from the Grim Reaper. So in order to fulfill both objectives, Hama sought out a compromise. At least in the very early issues of the comics, while characters who had toys selling in retail were still off limits, he instead created new ones to, well, kill off. But let's be clear, Hama didn't create a bunch of red shirts to use as cannon fodder. Most of these were pretty fleshed out and well-rounded characters, many of whom lasted a number of issues before biting the dust. Anyway, in case you haven't guessed by this point, this episode revolves around dead Joes and Cobras in the G.I. Joe universe. Mostly in the comics, but in modern times, even later cartoons and movies had their share of casualties. This will be quite the extensive episode that will cover multiple decades worth of stories, so let's get started, shall we? Oh, and I guess it goes without saying, there will be spoilers. You have been warned. So when it comes to the early Marvel comics, two specific characters immediately come to mind: the Eskimo mercenary Quinn and the evil Dr. Venom. Now, Quinn was introduced in the second issue of the comics, originally as an adversary for the Joes, but due to his strong sense of honor, gained a deep respect for the Joes and eventually turned into an ally, specifically to Snake Eyes. Dr. Venom was kind of the precursor to Dr. Mindbender, serving the role as the evil doctor for Cobra. As a kid, reading the Joe comics, I really didn't like Quinn. And as shallow as this might sound, I didn't like him because, well, he was ugly. A big, hulking guy who kept outsmarting the Joes that the comics seemed to constantly focus on. He also spoke funny, calling Snake Eyes Shadow Man, and speaking about vengeance and weasel spirits, which for a little boy was a bit too much to take in. It was only when I was much older that I came to really appreciate Quinn as a character. Anyway, the stories of Dr. Venom and Quinn are quite intertwined in that they hated each other, with the Eskimo mercenary hell-bent on killing the Doctor, and the Doctor looking for every opportunity to return the favor. Eventually, Quinn finally gets his chance to kill Venom, but in the end realizes that in his thirst for vengeance, he had become no better than the man he had sworn to kill. So, he lets Venom live, makes peace with himself, and walks away. Ever the opportunist, Venom pulls out a gun and shoots him repeatedly at his back, killing him. But as his dead body falls at a gloating Dr. Venom's feet, Quinn's hand opens, revealing a live grenade, which then explodes, killing Venom as well. And so ends the story of Quinn and Dr. Venom. Other notable character deaths from the comics include the original leader of the JOES, General Flagg, who was shot down in cold blood by Major Blood as he escaped the JOE prison. Of course, Blood only managed to accomplish that thanks to the help of a fellow prisoner, the lowly Cobra courier known only as Scarface, who figured quite prominently in the early issues as well. Injected with a dangerous toxin developed by Dr. Venom, turning him into a biological time bomb, Scarface is relentlessly pursued by both Cobra and G.I. Joe, and eventually ends up as a captive of the JOES, where, despite assisting the Major's escape, Scarface was left behind to die in said prison as the JOE headquarters is blown up. Another unfortunate forgotten pawn in the never-ending battle. Fortunately, despite his relatively early death in the series, General Flagg doesn't suffer the same fate, as his memory lives on in the iconic G.I. Joe aircraft carrier named after him, the USS Flagg. We also have some one-off characters worth mentioning as well. First up are the unfortunate other members of the ill-fated Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol that featured Snake Eyes, Storm Shadow, and Stalker in the Vietnam War. And that would be Ramon Escobedo and Dick Saperstein, who were both unfortunately killed off in a surprise encounter with some North Vietnamese soldiers. A sixth member, Wade Collins, who was also long thought dead, apparently survived and ended up joining Cobra until he was eventually convinced to rejoin the good guys by Stalker and Snake Eyes. His adoptive son, Sean Collins, ends up joining G.I. Joe as the ninja Kamakura. And while Dickie and Ramon never had the chance to join G.I. Joe, the rookies Mangler and Cool Breeze did, unfortunately both dying in their first missions. But they both died in heroic fashion. And while he started out as a major ass, Mangler did good, taking on a couple of armored vehicles on his own, causing them to crash, but unfortunately getting mangled under all the wreckage. But his sacrifice allowed fellow Joes Dusty, Outback, and Lightfoot to escape. And then we have Cool Breeze, another rookie soldier who was an overconfident know-it-all who didn't take anything very seriously. In the end though, he took a bullet to the chest meant for Stalker, so yeah, definite Joes in my book. But Joe deaths weren't limited to soldiers, but civilians closely associated with them as well, as was the case with the Arashikage Ninja Master, the Soft Master, who was the uncle of Storm Shadow. He spent his time in the comics investigating the murder of his older brother, the Hard Master, whom his nephew Storm Shadow was accused of killing. Eventually, he learns the true identity of his brother's assassin, but unfortunately dies sacrificing himself in an effort to save some civilians trapped in a car wreck from being blown up by the Cobra agent Scrap Iron, literally taking a missile for them. Unfortunately, despite his sacrifice, Scrap Iron then proceeds to blow up the car anyway, killing most of the civilians inside, one of which turns out to be Cobra Commander's son Billy, who survives, and a young lady named Candy Apple, who doesn't. Candy was the girlfriend of the Joe Halo Jumper Ripcord, and the daughter of the Cobra scientist and Crimson Guardsman named, well, Professor Apple, the mastermind behind the creation of Cobra Island. Anyway, he eventually dies as well, caught in a firebat launch blast as he tries to protect Ripcord from being killed by Storm Shadow, who believes him to be Zartan. Another story for another time. But speaking of Crimson Guardsmen, possibly the most famous of them would be the seventh one, Fred. 7. A mechanical genius who created Cobra Commander's now iconic battle armor and used it to impersonate the commander himself after he shoots down the OG Coco in the back and starts off a whole Cobra civil war on Cobra Island against the then reigning Cobra Emperor, Serpentor. A war that ends with the death of Serpentor, who is taken down by a single arrow to his forehead as he charges into battle. Thanks, Zartan. And speaking of thanks, I'd like to give my sincere gratitude to all of you viewers for watching my video. If you've gotten this far, I'm assuming you're digging this episode. And if you are, I hope you'll consider helping me and my channel out by sharing it to at least one of your friends. Of course, as always, a like, comment, or sub would also be greatly appreciated. Any action you choose works for me, so thank you. Now back to Fred 7. Unfortunately for him, the real commander eventually returns, having been saved by Fred 8, and exacts his revenge on the imposter by locking him up, buried alive in a sealed landlocked freighter under a volcano. And for good measure, he throws in a bunch of Cobra operatives whom he considers to be in league with the 7th Fred as well. Most notably the Birdman Raptor, Cobra Trainer Big Boa, Croc Master, Dr. Mindbender, and Voltar, who all die inside said freighter from botulism, having been forced to subsist on a batch of spoiled army rations. Basically, Hasbro's way of getting rid of the more kookier characters in the line. Cooler ones like Zartan and Firefly, who were also locked up, managed to survive. Anyway, aside from the unfortunate souls who met their ends locked up in that freighter, everyone mentioned up to this point had basically one thing in common, which was that none of them had any action figures available on store shelves, which was basically the loophole Hama used to great effect in the comics. After multiple years and numerous characters having been released in retail though, Hasbro eventually loosened their stance and relented to allowing the killing off of JOES who had action figures, but which were no longer available on shelves. Which brings us to that landmark story arc that starts off in the issue 109 with the ominous words of Casualties of War right there on the cover. Anyway, in a battle in the Middle Eastern country of Trucial Abysmia, a squad led by Duke is captured by Cobra and basically held prisoner in a dug-up pit. Fearing swift retaliation from the JOES, specifically Snake Eyes, Cobra Commander immediately orders his men to get rid of them. Let them go. But his vague command is then interpreted by the Crimson Twins as, well, kill them all. As the twins along with the rest of their soldiers leave the JOES, the dastardly deed is then carried out by a single bloodthirsty Saw Viper who starts off by blowing off the head of the original Joe medic, Doc, and then proceeds to rain down more bullets at the helpless captive JOES. Almost immediately, lesser-known JOES, Awe Striker Driver Crankcase, and Mauler Tank Operator Heavy Metal, who never quite gained the popularity of their predecessors Clutch and Steeler respectively, sacrificed their lives using their bodies as human shields to protect everyone else. Slugger Driver Thunder also bites it, taking multiple metal slugs in his body as well. Here's a fun fact. In the Sunbow Cartoons Writer's Guide, Thunder was originally intended to be paired up as a romantic interest of CoverGirl, which I actually think makes perfect sense given their shared specialty with tanks. But I guess CoverGirl was more into the roguish sailors. Anyway, the rest of the surviving JOES managed to take out the Saw Viper, along with a couple of Vipers, and commandeer an enemy tank in an attempt to escape. Unfortunately, they don't get far as the tank is blown up, killing off the OG Communications Officer Breaker, Silent Weapons Expert Quick Kick, and Assault Trooper Crazy Legs. Now, while I can understand really older characters like Breaker and Doc being unalived, given they had basically been replaced by the more visually vibrant Lifeline and Dial Tone respectively, Quick Kick's death to me was quite a bummer given I'm Asian. Crazy Legs was also a favorite of mine, but if a paratrooper had to be offed, I'm glad they went with him over Ripcord, who is a much more used character in the comics. And finally, we have Avalanche, Blaster, Blocker, Knockdown, Maverick, and DJ, collectively known as the Team from the Future, Battle Force 2000, whose main selling point was that they piloted a bunch of futuristic vehicles that could merge into a battle fortress. Unfortunately, while the concept on paper sounded cool, in execution it wasn't much of a success with the fans. And so just like that, the JOES' shiny new battle force turned into perfect candidates for annihilation, as they attempted to cross an oil field that was then ignited by enemy fire. The resulting explosions basically took out the entire team. Well, okay, one member, Dodger, dodged all that destruction and survived, eventually finding a new purpose in life as a member of a new subgroup, the Sonic Fighters. Now that pretty much covers the Marvel comics, but we're not done yet, as while the original Marvel run ended with issue 155 in 1994, the G.I. Joe Comics license was then picked up by Devil's Due Publishing in 2001, who then started their own series which was meant to be a direct continuation of the Marvel run set a few years later. Anyway, while not written by Hama, for the most part, I found this continuation quite entertaining, even if it did rehash the whole Cobra Civil War plot, with Cobra Commander once again taking on a resurrected Serpentor for leadership of Cobra. The epic war concluded on the 25th issue, which featured even more Joe deaths. OG Laser Trooper Flash and Computer Specialist Mainframe are captured as they attempt to make their escape after setting up a bunch of explosives inside a Cobra base. Realizing that they have no way out, they quietly accept their fate, and Flash says in his final last words, a serious and somber line of "Mission accomplished," as the bombs go off. Undercover Agent Chuckles also meets his end as he storms the beach alongside Duke and falls to the powerful Cobra operative Overkill, who embeds his fist right into the JOES' chest. And finally, we have the poor Joe codenamed Skidmark, who meets his unfortunate end when a helicopter literally crashes on him. And if you're wondering who wins this war, well, Serpentor is once again defeated and killed in a very impressive manner by Cobra Commander, who informs the fallen Emperor, made up of the DNA of history's greatest leaders, that he lacked the most important DNA of all, the Commanders, before he kicks him down a waterfall, possibly one of Coco's greatest moments in my opinion. Anyway, after that, towards the end of the Devil's Due run, the writers thought to shake things up even more by introducing a third faction to battle both G.I. Joe and Cobras, the Red Shadows, who were originally the enemies of the G.I. Joe UK counterpart, Action Force. Of course, this modern iteration is meant to be a different animal, and the writers set off to showcase just how dangerous they were by having them kill off a bunch of Joes and Cobras. Later released Joes, Hardball, Rampart, alongside the Argentinian Scarlet Recolor Glenda, are killed off when they discover the dead bodies of Cobra operatives Big Boa. Yeah, I know he died in the freighter in the Marvel run, so I guess this was a second individual to take up the name. And Asa Negra, a character that was originally released in Brazil. Not much love for South American characters, I guess. Oh, and the new G.I. Joe Navy SEAL, unimaginatively codenamed Tracker, is also gunned down in cold blood as he relaxes on the beach. If you didn't know who this guy was, well, that's okay. He was released in 1991 and I believe made some appearances in the Deke cartoon. All you gotta know is that he's in the running for one of the dumbest looking Joes in my book. Definitely not a fan, even if he and I shared the same first name of Christopher. But just so you don't get the wrong idea that the Red Shadows only killed obscure characters, the big death that would result with their introduction would be the original covert operations specialist and iconic Joe character, Lady J, who is murdered by the Red Shadow agent Della Eden right in front of a helpless Flint's eyes. It's a pretty brutal scene which many fans did not like. Fortunately, after Devil's Due run ended, the next publisher, IDW, basically made that whole continuity non-canon when they brought back the original writer Larry Hama to continue his G.I. Joe universe where he left it off at Marvel. And while I never followed that series, I did read quite a lot of IDW's original and alternate take on the franchise, which for a time I would consider as some of the best G.I. Joe stories ever written. IDW set off to establish an even more realistic take on the universe, and death was everywhere from day one. Of course, to be fair, they introduced quite a lot of red shirt characters literally created to be killed off, but every now and then they did manage to off some named characters as well. OG Heavy Laser Trooper Grand Slam was literally introduced and killed off in one page, the victim of a sniper fire to the head if I'm not mistaken. Another original 13 Joe, Steeler, was reimagined into a deep cover Cobra agent who killed off Breaker and a newer character named Firewall just to maintain his cover. Once his cover was blown though, he too was taken out by another Cobra sniper. An uncharacteristically mustachioed firefighter Barbecue met his end along with a squad of made-for-death Joes, Rat Race, Dead Check, Flakjack, Half Step, and Sand Crab, all mercilessly killed off by Cobra operative Crake in a bid to become the next Cobra commander in IDW's version of Civil War. Other Joe casualties of the war would be most of Snake Eyes dudes from Ninja Force, Dojo, Banzai, Nunchuck, Chabang, and Tsuginzu, who were, well, sliced and diced by Cobra Ninja duo, Slice and Dice. Deceptive warfare specialist and psychologist Psychout also died heroically battling an infected bat army in the IDW crossover Infestation. And missile specialist Bazooka also kicks the bucket, a hero, trying to thwart a Cobra kidnapping, getting riddled by bullets originally meant for a defenseless Scarlet. And of course, there were the big ones, with the Cobra series which served as the coming out party for often ridiculed flower shirt wearing undercover specialist Chuckles, who infiltrates Cobra, but unfortunately is forced to execute his handler and lover, Jinx, in order to prove his loyalty to the Snakes. He eventually gets his revenge though when he kills yet another version of Big Boa, as well as the original IDW Cobra commander before taking himself out, along with the Crimson Twin Zaymot, by detonating a nuclear sub parked underneath Cobra Island. A cooler and creepier version of Crocmaster is also introduced in the Cobra series, but unfortunately, he is also eventually killed off, trying to stop Cobra defector Erica Laten from escaping. Oh, and possibly the weirdest death of all would be the Joe Combat Information Specialist, Scoop, who in the IDW universe is a private investigator hired by Hawk to infiltrate a mysterious group called The Coil, which fronts as a self-improvement group but is actually a religious wing of the greater Cobra organization led by Stephen Menashian, better known as Discontinuity's version of Serpentor. Anyway, he gets sucked into the organization and gets brainwashed, and basically ends up as a human sacrifice to the perfect fusion of man and serpent, Golabulas. Once IDW was done, the next publisher to take over the G.I. Joe story would be Skybound, and in their brand new shared Energon universe with the Transformers, you can already count the OG machine gunner Rock and Roll to the list of Joe casualties, heroically throwing himself against the hail of Cobra Energon-fueled laser fire. But let's give that continuity a few more issues or hopefully years to tell its story. And that, I think, pretty much covers all the significant deaths that I am aware of in the G.I. Joe comics. I know that despite my maximum effort to make this as definitive as a list as possible, I won't be surprised if I missed out on any deaths. If I did, please do let me know in the comments below. In the meantime, I'd like to also mention the only G.I. Joe cartoon to my knowledge that portrayed actual deaths for both Cobra and G.I. Joe, and that would be the micro-series Resolute, wherein both Cobra mercenary Major Blood and once again the poor G.I. Joe missile specialist Bazooka met unfortunate off-screen deaths at the very start of the series. In the live-action movies, poor Cover Girl was gutted by Zartan along with her laptop in The Rise of Cobra. And in retaliation, pretty much the entire G.I. Joe team not named Roadblock, Lady J, or Joe Colton were pretty much decimated in a surprise airstrike in the desert, orchestrated by Zartan, posing as the President of the United States. The most notable casualty being Duke, thanks to the actor Channing Tatum wanting out of the franchise. But if you ask me, that's pretty okay since live-action Duke was in my book a poor man's version of the actual First Sergeant. You know, something you could order off Temu. If you want to know more about the real field leader of G.I. Joe, then you can check out his story over here. Or if you want any other G.I. Joe stories, you can check out this playlist over here. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope you come back for more.